welcome. I know we've got a lot going on this weekend, and delighted to see so many people here. This is the first of a series of presentations I will be doing Fridays here in the co-auditorium, almost every Friday this summer. And almost all of them revolve around what I call Backstage. And they are called Backstage because they're a way to go behind the scenes. You recognize, many of you, I think, the photos there. That very famous scene at the end of The Wizard of Oz where Toto bursts out of Dorothy's arms and runs over to this curtain and grabs the curtain and pulls it back, and you see this man manipulating all these levers, and he says, "I am the great and powerful, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain." And it's Frank Morgan, who was the actor who was portraying the Wizard of Oz. And he's revealed to be just a man. Just as a sidebar here, Frank Morgan, the same actor, was to play Buffalo Bill in the movie version of Annie, Get Your Gun in 1950, along with, oddly enough, Judy Garland as Annie Oakley. They were going to be reunited for the first time. Well, Garland wasn't able to make it. She had another commitment, and just before shooting began, Frank Morgan died. But one of those ironies of history. But at any rate, this notion of pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. In our case, we want to pull the flaps up on the curtain, or the tent flap, as you will, and focus on the man who's in the center of the arena, right there. And who is that? Well, of course, it's Buffalo Bill, otherwise known as William F. Cody. How many of you know Buffalo Bill? How many of you have heard his name before? How many of you know William F. Cody? Some people do. It's funny, even here in Cody, there are so many people who don't know William F. Cody. That's a story for another time. Our focus today is really on Buffalo Bill. And this Backstage presentation on Buffalo Bill looks at his character, gets kind of insights into his character, and it's drawn from a lot of sources, but especially from materials right from that time of Buffalo Bill's Wild West, from contemporary newspaper articles, from William F. Cody's own reminiscences, from the reminiscences of other people. So I hope you'll get some insights into the man behind the curtain, Buffalo Bill. And of course, I have to start off with the standard disclaimer here. This comes from a story that Cody himself told. There was one old-timer whom Cody liked to remember, California Joe. Joe, who had been a guide for Custer, could neither read nor write. As Cody liked to recall it, one time he and Wild Bill Hickok were drinking in a saloon when California Joe walked in. After shaking hands and partaking of a round of drinks, Joe said to Cody, "Bill, I hear you've writ a book about yourself." "Yes, Joe," Cody replied, "my life has been written." "You didn't forget about old Joe in the book you writ, did you, Bill?" "Certainly not," Bill said. "I couldn't leave you out of that after what you and I have seen." Joe extracted from Cody a promise to send him a copy of his book. Cody had every intention of making good on his promise, but forgot about it. Joe, in the meantime, settled down in a shack outside of Deadwood. One day a miner was going into town to buy some supplies, and Joe commissioned him to buy Bill's book for him. The miner looked through every store he could find, but could find no book bearing Cody's name. Not wanting to disappoint the old man, and knowing that California Joe could not read, the miner bought a Bible and gave it to Joe. "That's a fine book," said Joe as he clumsily turned the pages. "Look through it and read me what Bill wrote about me." The miner paged through a goodly portion of the Bible as Joe waited eagerly. At last he came to the part of the book of Daniel, where Daniel was thrown to the lions. He began to read it, substituting Joe's name for that of Daniel. Since there were mountain lions in California, it all seemed plausible to Joe. When the miner finished reading, Joe lit up with glee and remarked, "It's all true what Bill writ, every word of it. I remember the circumstances well. I was there with him when it happened." So every word of what you're going to hear is true, I swear. I was there when it happened. So, and I would be remiss if I did not welcome you on behalf of Buffalo Bill. As many of you know, he was fond of opening his performances by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, permit me to introduce you to the Congress of Rough Riders of the World." And he also would say how glad he was to see so many people here today. One time this led to the heartiest laughter and applause the company ever received. They played in a penitentiary in Auburn, New York in 1908, 1,400 inmates there. As he looked over the sea of pallid-faced felons, the colonel began his usual greeting, minus the ladies' part. "Gentlemen," he began, "you don't know how glad I am to see so many of you here today. He got no further. Pandemonium broke loose as hundreds of bucket stools were tossed in the air and the walls echoed with thunderous laughter. If it was a slip of the colonel's tongue through haste or had been intentional, it mattered not. It enshrined him to everybody's heart." So, on behalf of William F. Cody and on behalf of the inmates of the Auburn Penitentiary, it gives me great pleasure to see so many of you here today. So, Buffalo Bill's Wild West started in 1883, and it ran for 30 years until 1913, giving roughly 200 performances each season, and usually 2 performances a day. So, thousands and thousands of performances seen by millions and millions of people in North America, both in the United States and Canada, and also all through Europe. The show made 3 tours of Europe. And through film, which came in 1910, film footage of Buffalo Bill's Wild West, people in Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and other parts of the world were also seeing Buffalo Bill's Wild West. So he truly was the best known person in the world in his time. And, you know, had this remarkable reputation. Well, it very nearly ended before it happened, as you'll hear from this story, from the dress rehearsal of Buffalo Bill's Wild West, its very first dress rehearsal in May of 1883. From the first, Cody insisted on absolute realism in everything connected with his show. So naturally, the mules that drove his Deadwood stagecoach were wild and hard to handle, hardly broken to the feel of the harness. The stagecoach was to be filled with very important persons, the mayor and the town council of Columbus, Nebraska, where the dress rehearsal took place. The mayor, Pop Clothier, was popular, irascible, excitable, and quick with his fists. Shortly before the rehearsal began, Major Frank North and his Indians, all properly painted and feathered, took up their station in ambush, hidden out of sight behind a brush patch on the ground. The cowboy rescue party was hidden from view on the far side of the arena. Around 2 o'clock, the mayor and the councilmen arrived on the grounds, alighted from their rigs, and took position in front of the large crowd of spectators. Next came the Deadwood coach with its wide-eyed mules. The driver brought the coach to a halt, and the mayor and his party climbed in. As the band struck up Hail Columbia, the coach hurtled off at a barely controllable gallop. It made 3 fast circles around a half-mile track, and the mayor and the councilmen waved and smiled from the windows. The crowd cheered and waved back, exciting the mules all the more. The mules had already caught scent of the ambushed Indians and were showing definite signs of insurrection. Then as the coach passed the ambush spot for the 3rd time, the Indians burst forth, shrilling terrible war whoops and firing blank cartridges at the rig. The excited spectators knew what was coming, but the mules had not been advised of this part of the performance, nor had they been trained to respond to Indian massacre. So they bolted. Instantaneously, the stage driver had a full-blown stampede in his hands, a real runaway. As the flying mass swept past the crowd, the mayor stuck his head out the window, waved his hand frantically, and shouted, "Stop! Hell, stop! Let us out!" That was exactly what the stage driver was trying to do, but it was no use. The coach swept on around the track yet a 3rd time before the mules ran out of steam and winded, were finally pulled to a heaving halt in front of the crowd. The enraged mayor, scared out of his wits, leaped out of the coach and made straight for Buffalo Bill himself, ready for a fight. He started beating and pounding him. It took the combined efforts of the councilmen to restrain him from giving Cody a sound thrashing. At this moment, a young lawyer, Frank Evers, who was also the town wit and jokester, climbed to the top of the coach and addressed the delighted crowd. "Fellow citizens, it fills my breast with pride and swells my heart with joy to point to your view our noble mayor and city council. Look at these gentlemen, they risked their lives for your entertainment." So The show nearly ended with Buffalo Bill being killed even before it began. Fortunately for all of us, he escaped and was none the worse for wear, and they got the mules calmed down. So this all happened largely because of William F. Cody. He was the impresario, he was the star, he was the director, he was the producer. It was all because of him. As a newspaper account said in 1893, while seated behind the scenery that forms one end of the great arena, and on a platform from which all the movements of these people are directed, it was a wonderful study to watch the intimate knowledge possessed by the guiding mind of the entire enterprise, and see the speed with which his orders were obeyed, and the precision and promptitude that marked every movement of the 500 persons engaged in giving the performances. Buffalo Bill it was who directed all these people by a word, look, or gesture. As one item of the program was nearly finished, he would call to the interpreter or leader of the contingent whose turn it was to next appear in the arena, and giving his orders quickly and promptly, was obeyed by his subordinates with the same speed that marks the recognition on the part of any one of the mastermind and controlling spirit. It was evident from his every word, look, or gesture that Buffalo Bill was not in the ordinary sense a stage manager, but on the contrary, a born leader of men, who during the 40-odd years that he has been in command of men has held without wavering the confidence of commanders themselves. While his people carry out his every order, they do it not only with the appearance of respect for his superior ability and intimate knowledge, but with love for the man who, while commanding them, does so in such a gentle manner. So the sense of Cody the director, directing everything and earning the respect of the people that he directed. He was also a remarkable figure. As he rode through, people would comment upon him. As somebody said, he was a remarkable figure as he appeared on his horse. He was simply irresistible personally. He had this charismatic air about him, and he knew that. He absolutely knew it. And he capitalized on it. He was, in addition to being the best known person in the world, the most photographed person in the world in his time. There are thousands and thousands of photographs, some of which are I'm drawing from for this performance. Here's how he'd like to have his photo taken, and it shows you how much a sense he had of himself. Another strategist who turns the cold shoulder to a small camera but extends the most cordial of hands and faces to a machine the size of a barn is Colonel William F. Cody. There is even a suspicion that Buffalo Bill is, as his name would indicate, lying in readiness for this big game, the big game of being photographed. "Now, boy, what shall I do? What shall I wear?" he asked graciously. And before the photographer can make a suggestion, out comes the ever-ready costume, ready for the occasion. First the boots, then the coat with beads of wondrous hue, then the gloves of a similar design, then the wide-brimmed Stetson. As the cameraman prepares the shutter, there is perturbation at once on the colonel's part. The pulchritude of the prairies is at stake. Everything must be in ship-shape, or the small boy will lose faith in a great plainsman. "Hold on there, young man," he shouts. "Is my mustache okay? Be sure to get my hair long and fluffy, and don't forget my boots. Let the spurs show. How's the sunlight today?" And to put on the finishing touch, just as the photographer is ready to press the bulb, Buffalo Bill stops the proceedings and sends for an extra long cigar, which he holds nonchalantly in his right hand. The picture is complete. So there he is with his Stetson, his goatee, his coat, his boots, his cigar, all larger than life. As I said, he had a keen sense of himself and had a sense of his appeal. He understood the value of advertising, and they certainly had billboards all over the place, but he believed firmly that there was no substitute for the real thing, that the best advertising in the show was done by no other than Buffalo Bill himself. This is a story told by his longtime business associate, Pawnee Bill Leslie. And what happened here was that they had bought a new railroad car, a Pullman railroad car for the colonel. And Pawnee Bill Leslie was put in charge of refurbishing this railroad car for the colonel's benefit. And he brought the colonel to the factory to inspect it before it was ready to go. When the Colonel arrived in New York in the spring for our opening, I made a special trip with him over to Trenton, our new winter quarters, to see the private car. I pointed out the many changes I had made, including the wonderful strength of this car, it having an all-steel frame, its wonderful lighting, and the wonderful water system and bathrooms. He nodded, but didn't seem overly impressed. However, as we entered the car's big dining and observation room, the Colonel stood about the center, turned around slowly, and inspected the walls. I thought he was admiring the beautiful woodwork, when to my surprise he turned to me and said, "Major, I don't believe I have seen a single mirror in this entire car." "Oh yes," I replied, "we have nice large beveled mirrors, one in each of our private washrooms." "I know," he said, "but don't you think we ought to have a nice big mirror across that writing desk? You know, in our old car there were mirrors every place, and I sure liked that." The old private car had been built for a great opera star and used by her during her tours of America. Every panel in the car had a beveled plate glass mirror, so that sitting in any room and almost in any position, you could look in any direction and see a reflection in a mirror. This was what so pleased the Colonel. Many times I had seen him sitting in the center of our observation room, with large double windows on either side, especially on our Sunday runs, so that as we passed the various stations in the country towns, the crowds who invariably came to the station to see our two trains pass through could see him. If the train stopped for any reason and there was a big crowd out there, he would invariably take from his breast pocket his big comb, run it through his long gray curly hair, put on his large Stetson and say to me, "Major, I'd better go out and do some advertising." He'd stroll out to the observation platform and walk down side to side, apparently taking in the town. But his prime object was to give the crowd a better chance to see him. You see, the Colonel understood that his two biggest fortes in the show business were his appearance and his ability to capitalize on it from an advertising standpoint. So he understood the power of his charisma, kind of like a lot of politicians today, I think. And he was very vain, as you might guess about his appearance. This is a story that's told by a friend of his who took him to the theater in New York. Buffalo Bill attended a performance of The Officer Boy at the Victoria Theater last night, and between the acts went behind the scenes to have a chat with his old friend and comedian Frank Daniels. He was standing just inside Mr. Daniels' dressing room when Eva Tanguay, the starlet of the show, passed by and saw him. "I'd like a lock of that hair for a souvenir," the little actress declared to one of the chorus girls. "Dare you to cut it off," ventured her counterpart. The girl brought a pair of scissors, and Miss Tanguay cautiously stepped up behind Buffalo Bill, selected a wisp that stuck out from behind the hairpin, and snipped it off. The hero of many Indian battles slapped his hand to his pate and turned just in time to see the smiling face of Miss Tanguay disappearing in the wings. "Thundering rain in the face," he yelled, shaking his fist good-naturedly at the retreating starlet. "Why, if you were a man, I'd have your scalp." Turning to Daniels, he asked, "Is it much?" patting his hair and vainly trying to get on an angle in a looking glass. "No, not very much," replied the comedian. "You've still got one hair left." So he was very vain about his appearance. But he felt that it worked. You know, crowds came flocking to see performances of Buffalo Bill's Wild West. As Cody himself said, talking about one time he took the show to the Midwest before he quit the show business, "I didn't expect to make a cent of money on that trip. I went because I was always getting letters from old-timers asking me why I didn't ever visit them with my show. But I made money hand over fist. People drove 300 miles to see my show. They came so fast that their cows went dry before they got back home. Yes, that's a fact. I got letters from them telling me their cows went dry." Well, I'm not maybe a little bit of exaggeration there, we'll grant him that. But one time, he made a bet with his sister about his ability to draw a crowd. And we'll see how that bet turned out. This is told by his sister Helen Cody Wetmore in her memoir, Last of the Great Scouts. It's kind of a biography of him. In 1996, the Wild West exhibition visited both Duluth, Minnesota, and North Platte, Nebraska for the first time. Duluth, which was her hometown, had a population of 65,000. North Platte, where my brother's Scout Rest Ranch was located, numbered 3,500. When Will wrote me of his intention to take the Wild West to Duluth, He offered to make a wager with me that his little town would furnish a bigger crowd than would the city of my residence. I could not accept any such inferred slur upon the Zenith city, so I accepted the wager. A silk hat against a fur cloak. October 12th, the day of the North Platte performance, dawned bright and cloudless. Today decides our wager, said Will. I expect there will be 2 or 3 dozen people out on this prairie. Duluth turned out a good many thousands, so I suppose you think your wager is as good as won. My brother's surmise was correct. I was, in fact, in my mind, already the possessor of a fine fur cloak. As we started for the grounds, Will was evidently uncertain over the outcome, in spite of his previous boast of the reception North Platte would give him. We'll have a big tent and plenty of room in it to spare, I'm afraid, he observed. But as we drove close to the grounds, we soon began to see indications of a coming crowd. The people were pouring in from all directions. As the dust was nearly a foot deep on the roads, the very atmosphere seemed populated, and the moving populace made the air almost too thick for breathing. Where the crowds came from, it was impossible to say. It looked as if a feat of magic had been performed, and that the very stones had been turned into people, or that as in olden times they came up out of the earth. Accustomed though he was to the success of the show, Will was dumbfounded by this outpouring. As the crowds continued to pour in, I became alarmed about my wager. I visited the ticket seller and asked how the matter stood. It's pretty close, he answered. Duluth seems to be dwindling away before the mightiness of the great American desert. This section of the country, which had been a wilderness only a few years before, assembled over 10,000 people to attend a performance of the Wild West, and so Will won himself a silk hat, which is in our collection. The hat is there on the left, and the fur cloak, which was Helen Wetmore's, is there on the right. So somehow he must have come through her one way or another. Well, the show was popular, so was Buffalo Bill himself. You can imagine he being the first celebrity of modern times, that everybody wanted to follow him. Everybody wanted to see him. Everybody wanted to get as close as they could to him. And this was a problem for him. As one of his associates said, when I first called on him, he was busy clipping newspaper articles about himself. He got much publicity and liked it. He was a great drawing card. People would come on horseback from a distance of 50 miles just to get a glimpse of the colonel. He was feted in every city, and he entertained in turn. But he had to lay down strict visiting rules in order to avoid being overcome. Everybody wanted to come and see him. Cody himself worried about this and complained about it. As he said in an interview in 1902, every person seems to want you to guess his name. There isn't time, you know. One man came into my tent the other day and wanted me to guess who he was. Who the hell do I think you are? I said to him, after I'd been waiting full 20 minutes. Well, sir, I can't recall your name. Then it turned out that the fellow had come in with me on the first train that had come out to California. He was in the immigrant car and I was in the Pullman. So the guy was 20 cars away. And the Buffalo Bill was supposed to know him. That's a specimen. Then there was another man. He was a young fellow, about 26. He asked me if I didn't remember him. Turned out that one's mother had brought him nearly 24 years ago to see my show. He was 2 years old at the time. So Cody was constantly getting deluged by people. But he also welcomed people, and particularly children. He had a real soft spot in his heart for children. This is a newspaper article from the New York Times of 1907 about a little girl who rode 140 miles to see her hero. Few children at 12 years of age can boast of having traveled from the Atlantic to the Pacific, covered most of Europe, and met so many distinguished persons, as has Alma Rose Miller of Monticello, New York. Little Miss Alma is also an expert horsewoman, and she would rather sit a horse and ride all day than employ her time in such amusements as children of her tender age generally do. Only a few days ago, she rode from the family home at Hempstead, Long Island, to Monticello, a distance of 140 miles. It goes on to say about how she's met presidents and President McKinley and Ulysses S. Grant and so forth. But above all these, and dearest to her childhood heart, was meeting Colonel William F. Cody, Buffalo Bill. Her interview with the famous scout after that 140-mile ride held in his big tent while the Wild West show was exhibiting in Brooklyn, capped the climax of her ambition and her fondest dream. As she walked proudly away from the showgrounds, she was heard to murmur, "Ponies, hundreds of them, and Buffalo Bill. This is what I wanted to happen so many years ago, and now it is all over." So she got her dreams by meeting Buffalo Bill. Some of the callers were a little bit more bothersome to the Colonel. One time the show was in St. Louis, and as Colonel Leslie, Pawnee Bill, who I mentioned a few moments ago, tells this story, you'll understand why Cody was beginning to have a difficult time with things. It also says something about the kind of person he really was. One of the Colonel's great prides was his nerve. He liked to talk of his early days when his nerve was tested almost daily. And many a pleasant hour had I spent listening to him relate his deeds of valor and courage. When we reached St. Louis, a peculiar incident occurred. A big brewer lived there, and whose hobby was gas balloons, tried to get Colonel Cody to make a trial in one of his balloons. A young gentleman approached me at the front door of the show about noon, and said he had been sent by Mr. X, the aforementioned brewer, to see if Colonel Cody would make a balloon ascension that afternoon. I went back with a messenger to the Colonel's private tent, and the young man extended him the invitation. The Colonel listened attentively, turned the matter over in his mind reflectively, looked at me inquiringly, and said, "What is this fellow trying to do?" And then turned and said to him, "Young man, you fellows seem to think our lives are just one continued round of pleasure. Why do you realize that I have not one moment to spare from the time I get into town until I go to my private car at night? I can hardly find time to answer my mail." "Colonel," interrupted the young man, "Mr. X will have his automobile right at the back entrance. The balloon is already inflated and ready to go. I can have you back here in 2 hours or less, if necessary." The Colonel replied, I didn't rest very well last night, and I'm not as young as I used to be. I was planning on getting some rest and a nap at the close of the afternoon performance." The young man came back with a countercharge that he might never have another such opportunity again. And by the way, what great advertising it would be. At this, the Colonel lost his patience. Rising from his chair, he said, "Look here, young man, just tell Mr. X with my compliments that if I had 30 years to stay here and didn't have anything else to do, I wouldn't get up in a darn balloon if it was the last thing I did." As the young man made his exit, he looked at me and winked with a broad smile. After he was gone, the Colonel said to me, "Well, what do you think of that?" "No, sir, I draw the line there. Why, when I built my big new barn on my North Platte ranch, I crawled up to the roof to get a view. When I looked down over the side, it made my head spin like a top. Yes, sir, the earth suits me pretty well." So, for all his courage, the Colonel was afraid of heights and kept his feet on terra firma. This, by the way, this is a cover of one of our hundreds of dime novels in our collection. There are at least 3 that show Buffalo Bill in balloons, and it shows you the departure between reality and fiction. I mean, he really was terrified of heights, and the idea that he would ever go up in a balloon, as you hear, was something he would never do. But these stories talk about him rescuing people, flying in a balloon to rescue them, and so forth. So, difference between Buffalo Bill, I guess, and William F. Cody. At one time, this little newspaper article here, he nearly was assassinated. He was sitting in his tent, reading his mail, and some guy walked in and pointed a loaded gun at him, and tried to fire it, but fortunately one of his fellow employees saw this and rushed in and knocked the guy down before he could actually do anything, and they took him away. So, you know, there are times when Colonel Cody really did have to be concerned with who came into his tent and who didn't. One visitor to his tent prompted one of the rare shows of anger that Colonel Cody's fellow employees were fortunate or maybe unfortunate enough to witness. This is his daughter, Irma, who at the time of this story was about 12 years old. I remember only a few occasions, and this is told by one of his colleagues, I remember only a few occasions when William F. Cody lost complete control of his temper. One time happened when a Boer War veteran, it happened with Vanderloo. He had been a field cornet in the Boer army and was really a striking figure. He hadn't been with the Wild West show more than a few weeks when he fell in love with Irma, Cody's daughter, who was then, I should say, no older than 12. When van der Loo proposed to her, Irma took it as a big joke, and to carry it further, suggested that maybe Mr. Van Loo should ask her father for her hand in marriage. And so, with all the timidity of a lover and with the courtly formality of the continent, van der Loo put the question to the former frontiersman. Van der Loo may have been prepared for a rebuff, but he certainly did not foresee the cyclone of abuse he raised in Irma's father. It is related that what Cody said to him was worthy of the composite efforts of all the old Mississippi steamboat captains and boss canvasmen combined. Van der Loo emerged from Cody's tent as white as a sheet, and for days afterwards he went about his work like a man who had been tilting with ghosts. So you didn't dare go after the colonel's dear daughter. The other time when people saw him get mad, Colonel Cody, Buffalo Bill, could control just about everything, but he couldn't control the weather. And this is a two-part story. First is a description of what happened in California, Los Angeles, California in 1902 during a performance there when somebody slipped up. The first entrance was of the several detachments of cavalry, preceded by the several tribes of Indians. The gallop of the first squad disclosed that the arena had not been sufficiently sprinkled. What that means is that the watering crew had not done their job. It could easily have been supposed that no water whatever had been used. So great and unmitigated was the cloud of dust that rose with every strike of a hoof. Such, however, was not the case. In addition to the 2 regular water wagons belonging to the show, 3 had been hired from the city. All 5 had worked until noon from 9 o'clock in the morning, but when noon came, the city wagons quit. Their drivers belonged to a union and could not work during the noon hour. The manager of arrangements, thinking that enough water was already in the grounds, took off his own wagons too. In the succeeding 2 hours before the afternoon performance, the sun dried up, and all the water the ground didn't soak in. When the Wild West show began to do business, everybody knew what Southern California dust can be at its worst. Those who sat on the lee side were buried, and the operations in the arena were obscured from these as well as from everybody else. The dust all but ruined the first performance. It distressed the spectators, annoyed the performers, and was an overwhelming injury to the most successful engagement of the season. I was at the night rodeo the other night, and we had the wind come in with dust, and it obscured things, and that wasn't as bad. This photograph here shows that actual event that is being described to you, and you can barely see these riders riding out of that big cloud behind them. So, as you can imagine, it was an embarrassment to Cody, who wanted to run things ship-shape. So, here's part 2 of the story. The dust nuisance worried the old scout and showman greatly, and he was distressed at the results of the ground superintendent's negligence in not having the arena adequately sprinkled. The following day, just before the afternoon show, Colonel Cody summoned the sprinkling boss to his private tent. He began remonstrating with his employee, warning him to be more punctual in this dusty country. But the foreman was primed for a fight, and before Cody had uttered half a dozen sentences, he broke out with a profane oath. "I've followed you around like a dog for 4 years," the foreman shouted, "and I've had enough of it. I'll show you up. If you monkey with me, I'll make sure you're published in the papers tomorrow morning." Buffalo Bill arose from his chair and walked over to his angry subordinate. There was a loud exchange of picturesque words. Suddenly, Buffalo Bill turned on his heel, took a few strides, and swung out with his right, straight from the shoulder. The blow caught the belligerent foreman squarely on the point of the jaw and sent him in a heap to the wall of the tent, 5 feet away. Of the tens of thousands who witnessed the performance, less than half a dozen witnessed the most interesting incident of the entire engagement. It was simply a private exhibition of the character of Colonel W.F. Cody, a line on the old warrior, the limelight and the applause of admiring multitudes. It showed that years and modern influences have not greatly changed the impetuous, nervy, rough and ready Buffalo Bill. The courteous frontiersman had received a bluff, and he called it. He had received an insult, and he resented it. His authority was defied, and he reestablished it. So he was not above striking out with his fists if he needed to. It wasn't like that all the time, of course. When He could really have a heart of gold, especially with his employees, as this story told by one of his former cowboys, Walter Webb, who was the chief of cowboys, told this story. We soon wised up even to working the colonel out of a ticket for someone, usually a girl. We wanted to get in to see the show, a habit we worked overtime. They would go and ask for free passes. Our pitch never buried. We had run across an aunt or an uncle, or a cousin or two. The old colonel never once during the season refused us, but we weren't fooling him one bit. As he initialed the free passes, he would usually say, "It sure does beat hell how many relatives you dang cowpunchers run into way back here." But I remember one time my good pal George Gaspipe Mullison toddled up to the colonel's office, so pie-eyed drunk he had to hang onto the door casing. "Colonel," we heard him say, "could I get a pair of free passes? I got a couple of floozies waiting out here." We could hear the colonel chuckling for some time after Gaspipe had left. He was used to lies, but I guess this was the first time he'd had the truth sprung on him. So, he did have a heart of gold. He would open up the show to orphans every year when they performed in big cities like Philadelphia or New York or Chicago. He would always have one day out of the year where the hospitals, the orphanages, the asylums were opened up and all the kids were let in for free. This is an illustration from a Chicago newspaper of 1897 where the kids were allowed in for a free performance. And he also had heart of gold for those who couldn't make it, as we hear from this story from Boston in 1895. During a recent visit of Buffalo Bill's Wild West, the grounds upon which the show was held were very near the children's hospital. The music of the cowboy band, the sound of the gunshots and the attack on the settler's cabin, and so on, all attracted the children's attention. When they were told that the noises were made by Indians, their grief at their confinement increased in proportion to their desire to see a real Indian. One of the young children asked the visiting surgeon if there was any way this could be brought about. And the surgeon suggested writing a letter to Buffalo Bill and asking him. The boy wrote the following letter. "Dear Mr. Buffalo Bill, we are a lot of little children lying on our backs in the hospital, and we cannot move. We want to see an Indian very much. We have never seen one in our lives and cannot get out. Will you please send us one so that we can see him?" Buffalo Bill was evidently touched by this appeal, for presently 6 Indian braves and an Indian mother with a papoose visited the hospital and walked about the wards in full regalia, greatly to the delight of the children. The children wanted the Indians to execute a war dance in one of the wards, but the chief surgeon demurred on account of the floors, which he thought were too slippery for a proper performance of the ceremony. But you have the sense of Cody sending out a delegation of his show Indians to give a special performance for the kids in the children's hospital. So, a heart of gold. Cody himself, he was the one who gave the orders, but he realized there were times when the tables were turned. In the mid-1890s, when the show traveled on its second tour, early 1890s, when it made its second tour of Europe, they went to Bavaria. And Crown Prince Leopold, who was the ruler, kind of the acting ruler of Bavaria, was very impressed by the bucking broncs that he had seen perform. And he asked for a private demonstration so that he could see how the bucking broncs really worked. He didn't believe that they were real. So he made arrangements with Cody to come and see the bucking broncs. Unfortunately for both Cody and the prince, they made the appointment for 9 o'clock in the morning. The prince had another engagement, and so he showed up at 8 o'clock in the morning before Cody got there. Here's what happened. The horses were brought out just the same, Prince Leopold observing everything narrowly. He asked who was going to mount the horse. Thought there might be something in that. He was told that any of the cowboys would mount it. It didn't matter which. One of the cowboys was mounting when the prince objected to his spurs. "Take those off," he said. A prince has to be obeyed. The spurs were taken off. All this time, Prince Leopold was standing dangerously near our bucking horse. Langdon, our big one-armed cook, was standing nearby, and knowing the danger, begged the prince to stand farther back. But the prince was determined to see everything, and before there was time to prevent it, the horse gave a violent plunge, and horse, rider, cook, and prince were suddenly in a heap on the ground. As I came into the arena, this is Cody, I met a man riding up to me in great excitement. "Make haste, Governor! The prince is killed, we think." When I got there, the prince was insensible, but he is a game old fellow, though 70 years of age, and he was soon up again. He was quite convinced about the genuineness of the bucking horses after that, and gave handsome presents both to Langdon and to the man who mounted the horse. And he also gave a blanket to the horse. So Prince turned out to have a heart of gold himself, too. Speaking of animals, one of the animals that everybody wanted to see at Buffalo Bill's Wild West was, of course, the buffalo, because people had never seen buffalo before. And so the Wild West show had a troop of buffalo, had a herd of buffalo that they used to graze in captivity when they weren't being used in performances. Well, they went to San Francisco, and here's what happened. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show came to town, and as luck would have it, Park Commissioner Reuben Lloyd, dressed in his best suit of broadcloth, attended the matinee on admission day. Now, I should interject here and say that the San Francisco Zoo had a herd of buffalo that they were having some trouble with. And Commissioner Lloyd was on the board of the zoo. Lawyers' brains are never inactive, and Mr. Lloyd's were working overtime on this occasion. When the herd of buffalo rushed into the enclosure, he picked out one that particularly struck his fancy. He wanted that one, and he figured as to how the city could get it. He made a proposition to exchange bulls with Colonel Cody, the plea being made that the future welfare of the herds demanded such an exchange. Now, as a matter of fact, Colonel Cody had been looking for somebody to unload his bull buffalo on. The brute terrorized the whole herd. It would not go in and out of its cars and generally made a nuisance of itself. So Commissioner Lloyd has a bull buffalo that he's not thrilled with, and Colonel Cody has a buffalo he's not thrilled with. What a deal. The deal was made, and each party thought it was handing a gold brick to the other. 20 cowboys hauled the Wild West buffalo to Golden Gate Park, and reinforced by the mounted police were able to take the other one back to the show. As soon as the buffalo from the park landed in a corral of the Wild West, he jumped a fence 6 feet high and knocked down 2 tents. Then he took off to the timbers above the affiliated colleges. He was dragged back, and Sunday night 50 cowboys, 10 Mexicans, and 20 soldiers got the animal into the car, ready for Salinas. Last night at Salinas, the brute gave a big exhibition when he was released from the car. He killed 2 horses and made such a run that he terrorized the whole town. Buffalo Bill's former bison, his former pet that is now at the park, is having his own hot time. Yesterday afternoon, he alternated his amusements by playing center tackle with the wire entrance gate to the paddock and chasing the other buffaloes up the trees. The question is, who landed the gold brick? The lawyer or the man that runs the Wild West show? I don't know. Well, there were lots of interesting animals to see at Buffalo Bill's Wild West. You know, you had horses, bucking horses, you had wild bison, you had bears. Cody was asked one time what he considered to be the meanest and ugliest animal he'd ever seen. "Well," replied Colonel Cody after reflecting a minute, "the ugliest and maddest 4-footed beast I ever saw travels with my show, where I meet him every morning. It's a dog. Not a wild dog, just a common everyday dog, who has trials that have soured his naturally jovial disposition and transformed him at times into a demon. He sleeps in a ticket wagon. Every night before he goes to bed, the ticket seller gives him a bone, which he promptly conceals in a hole dug beneath the wagon. Then he goes to bed, failing to realize that almost every night we pick up and move, and his house is shifted over the road. He can't understand why the next morning's search for the bone is futile. Then he gets mad. He thinks someone has stolen it, and it isn't safe to go near him for several hours. Sometimes we stop several days in a place, and then, of course, he finds the bone, and it's just enough incentive to keep him digging holes. Why, he's planted bones all over this country and the greater part of Europe, but he's lost 99 out of every 100 he's planted." So there's the meanest animal in the world, that poor dog that can never find his bone because the show moved every night. So Cody loved horses, and his favorite horse was a beautiful white steed named Isham. Buffalo Bill's Wild West went bankrupt in 1913, and all of the assets of the show, all of the properties, all the animals were seized and auctioned off at a sheriff's sale. Here's what happened. Prior to the auction, when the time came up to draw up the claims of Colonel Cody for his personal property, his attorneys included Isham on the list, the famous white horse he rode at every performance for many years, believing that it belonged to him. But looking away and covering the quiver of his lips with a light stroking of his gray mustache, Buffalo Bill said, "We were together a long time and we knew each other better than brothers, but I cannot claim Isham as my own, since he became the property of the company when Major Lilly and I formed our partnership." So he's no longer the Colonel's. During the auction of bankrupt Wild West show property, friends of Colonel Cody outdid each other when Isham was offered for sale by the auctioneer. The bidding was spirited. Staunch friends of Colonel Cody had made an agreement that Colonel J.C. Bills of Lincoln, Nebraska would bid on Isham for presentation to Buffalo Bill. Carlo Miles, an Indian, was unaware of the agreement, but with the same purpose in view, went his limit in bidding. Colonel Bills, the Nebraska man, opened the bidding at $10, the price agreed upon. $20, declared Carlo Miles. $25, $35, $50 came the bids from all sides in the same breath. The bid was raised $5 or $10 a time until $150 was offered by J.C. Bills, the man from Nebraska. In the meantime, Carlo Mills had lost his traditional stoicism. Tears had begun to form in his eyes and were rolling down his cheeks. The bidding was carrying him beyond the value of his outfit. "I can't go further," he told a friend in a half-whisper, "but if the man who buys that horse don't give him back to Colonel Cody, I'll steal the horse tonight and take it to him myself." When Mills was told that all the bidders had had the same idea of buying the horse for Colonel Cody, he wept tears of joy. And so Buffalo Bill has lost his Wild West show, but he has not lost old Isham, the famous white horse on which he used to ride. The millions who have admired him will now imagine him riding out on Isham just as he used to, and then removing the broad sombrero and sweeping gesture, saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, for over 30 years I have waved goodnight to you. The time has come when the old scout must no longer follow the trail. This time it is goodbye." So he got Isham in the end. Took Isham out to his T.E. Ranch, which is about 30 miles south of town, and used to ride him around there whenever he visited. So what is fame? What's it all about? An observer who saw Buffalo Bill had this to say. "Buffalo Bill is beyond question the best known American and the one most talked of in Europe. In Germany, I found that the people there regarded him as one of the generals in the American army, and that this Wild West show was kind of a lark. In Spain, they looked upon him as a senator, and that he took to shooting at glass balls as a pastime. In Italy, thousands regarded him as a cabinet officer, taking a party of Indians and cowboys around the world for the benefit of their health. In France, England, and Ireland, he is looked upon as a candidate for nomination as President of the United States. There is no public, professional, or scientific man in the United States who is in it with Buffalo Bill in Europe. And yet men still want to be judges and men want to be congressmen, when they might achieve just as great fame by being a cowboy, like they used to in their dreams when they still went to school. What a strange world theirs is." So he's saying, you want to aspire after fame and ambition? Mamas, let your boys grow up to be cowboys. So, last story here. They went to Europe. Again, I made 3 tours there, as I said. And in 1892, visited Germany. And Major John Burke, Cody's PR officer, recollected this anecdote about their visit. "We were going up the Rhine, and we didn't have half the show we have now. The young Kaiser Wilhelm was coming down the river in state on his first tour after becoming emperor. Kaiser Bill stopped off at Koblenz just as Buffalo Bill's show was passing through. Kaiser Bill had 5 railroad cars. Buffalo Bill had 75 railroad cars, with brass bands, cook wagons, and open cars in full operation, Indians sitting around wrapped in their blankets, cowboys skylarking, and all that, making a grand show and attracting much attention. I was standing on the train platform after the departure of both. Our band playing De Wacht on Rhine, the Kaiser's band playing the Star-Spangled Banner. When the station master, addressing his companions, exclaimed, "Gott in Himmel, dis Oberst Amerikanist ist größer als der Kaiser," meaning this American is greater than the Kaiser. Well, indeed, many people thought he was greater than the Kaiser, greater than anything they'd ever seen. So, with the tip of his hat, the old colonel bids you farewell, and with him I thank you for your time. Hope you'll enjoy the rest of your tour, and I hope too you'll come back here next year. We are going to be closing down the Buffalo Bill Museum this October, and we're going to be taking everything out, down to the drywall, and putting in all new exhibits, all new displays, hold a lot of stories, a lot more interactive exhibits, a lot of things that I think will appeal to people of all ages. And so we hope you'll come back here in May of next year, right before Memorial Day weekend, or for our grand opening next July 4th weekend, for an all-new Buffalo Bill Museum. But in the meantime, you've still got the old one to enjoy. And again, thank you for your time. If there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.